They make them alive for you if you bring them into your consciousness. I mean, I can't do that. I can only propose that this was a way of reaching a transcendental understanding for some people in the ancient world. It's very important to mention, for instance, I don't know how many of you are aware of the work of Ernest G. McLean, Pythagorean Plato, The Myth of Invariance, Meditations through the Koran. He's a musicologist at Brooklyn College. I guess he's elderly now. And he's done very similar things to this entirely in musical metaphor. And the reason it works is because the Greek double octave maps on to the double cycle. And so whatever you've done, whatever I've shown you geometrically, you could also produce musically. But it's how you internalize it. I can't make it real. No one should believe me about transcendence. You got to try it. I mean, you can't believe anybody else about that. If you know it's ego death, it isn't ego death. Right? It's a problem there.
On the musical question, do each of the letters have a sound? Because
yes.
A lot of the ways to transform is with sound. And
we have a musical version of the text that we played out simply by assigning notes to each letter and going up the scale in alphabetical order. And the text is very evocative when you do that. But I don't think that's the right sound. We'd have to determine the sound of each letter. What I would propose to do is to take these shadowgrams and treat them like little graphs and run a Fourier transform on them to find their harmonic components and then see if that made sense as a kind of sound for each letter. Because see, then when you heard the sound, that would produce a point of conscious focus in your mind too. I mean, sound connects to feeling very directly. Also, these texts are all chanted. People don't read, observant Jews don't read the Torah on a weekly. They read the Torah through every year, week by week. They sing it. The singing is primary, not the speaking of it.
Is there a set melody or something?
There is now, but it's not clear how far back it goes. Also, there were hand gestures that used to go with it, which are lost, except that some of the Yemenite Jews know the hand gestures, but there's only a few thousand left. So it's not obvious. They've never been written down.
If you could build an ideal model for this, animated 3 dimensions at least, what basically would it look like to become these shapes? Would you?
Well, what does a hypersphere look like, or a hypercube?
Yeah, I mean, how would you put it in computer graphics?
It doesn't look like anything. It's a feeling.
So your feelings would best if it was generated by your feelings. Then.
Let me give you an example. Let's say there were creatures living in flatland, two-dimensional reality, and we looked down on them. As far as they're concerned, we'd be God. We could see their whole world in a glance. We could see inside of their bodies. If we wanted to talk to the flatlanders, what would we say to them, and how could we say it? Well,
you have to somehow hang out there for a while.
Well, we don't fit in flatland, and they don't know about 3 dimensions.
Well, conceptually, I guess.
Well, what's the most important thing to say to a flatlander? Anybody want to guess?
Hi.
Well, that's right. Edwin Abbott actually proposes this question in his book, Flatland. What is it? Anybody remember? What's the question you ask a flatlander? What's the most important thing to tell a flatlander?
What direction you're heading?
Sort of. Hello, look up. There's an infinitely greater universe transcendent to your own. You know, just like what God would like to tell us. You know, assuming there's a God. I mean, after all, what's the most important thing? How does God prove himself? Well, think about it. What could the flatlander? What could we do to communicate with a to transmit this message? Saying it wouldn't do any good. Who would believe it? I mean, you know, if God tapped you on the shoulder and said, "Hey, I'm God," would you believe him? Nobody else seems to.
Maybe.
I mean, we've had that situation. People don't believe it.
Maybe you saved their lives in some mysterious way.
Well, I'll tell you one way. If you projected onto Flatland a hologram of a 3-dimensional scene, Flatlander couldn't see it, of course, because he'd have to get out of Flatland and shine his laser reference beam on it in order to see it. So that wouldn't work. But what if the Flatlander were to rhythmically traverse the pattern on the surface of his flatland day by day and year by year for a lifetime, building up on his cortex a model of a higher dimensional pattern, and then in a flash, maybe by a trauma, he gets hit on the head, maybe he's meditating, maybe he takes some interesting chemicals, whatever. Maybe he just goes into alpha. He would read out in a glance, in a Kundalini stroke, he would get a glimpse of 3 space, and then he'd believe. Well, these texts are rhythmically chanted day by day and year by year by Orthodox Jews for the last 2,500 years anyway.
So the feeling of transcendence and the feeling of creation are pretty...
It's the feeling. It snaps into place when you grok it, when you sense it. This is a living system, yes.
What dimensionality do you figure it is?
I think we're looking at a fractal pattern that stretches from 3 dimensions where we are and reaches towards 4 dimensions. And when it gets to 4 dimensions, it starts over again in the point and unfurls again. I think we're looking at an embedded recursive system where you go from 0-dimensional seed point, which has an intrinsic spin to it, an intrinsic spin in the seed point. Where's my... Here they are. See, this is a sphere point. Think of the tetrahedron defines a sphere. That's what defines a ball. And then there's this intrinsic spinningness. It's like a pregnant point. And it sort of bootstraps itself, corkscrews its way into 1 dimension. The seed sprouts a 1-dimensional line stem. And the line stem, at the top of a little sprout, there is a pair of leaves forming a surface. And then within those leaves, eventually a bud comes up, a volume. And then from the bud, a flower blossoms. And the flower gets all crenellated, all bent over on itself, because it doesn't quite fit in 3 dimensions. It overflows 3 dimensions. You know what the most common 4-dimensional object is? We all see it all the time. A fruit is a 4-dimensional object. It is an extrusion of a living thing into our reality. And then, of course, within the fruit is a 0-dimensional seed that starts the process over again.